everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm Tim McCarthy, the Director of the Sexuality, Gender, and Human Rights Program at the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy. And we're very excited today to be hosting Peter Dreier, who has just published a new book, The 100 Greatest Americans of the 20th Century, a Social Justice Hall of Fame. And the title of today's talk will be, is a new progressive movement upon us, lessons from a century of social justice leadership. And I just wanted, I'm just here to welcome everyone. I'm going to turn it quickly over to my friend and colleague, Marshall Gans, who many of you know is also a faculty member here. And he's going to introduce Peter, who's been a longtime friend of his. And Marshall. All right, how's it going? Thanks. Well, good evening. Good evening. Good afternoon. What's it? Is it afternoon or evening? What is it? Good spring. Good spring. It's nice to see light and sun and warmth. It's just great out there. It's a privilege to introduce my friend, colleague, and collaborator, Peter Dreier, who is the E.P. Klopp Distinguished Professor of Politics and Director of Urban and Environmental Policy Department at Occidental College in LA. That's the official part. So now, I wanted Peter to own up a little bit of his story, which is not too surprising. He was born in Newark, New Jersey. His father was a garment worker, his mom was a secretary. Went to Syracuse University as an undergraduate on a baseball scholarship. She's a pitcher. And did he ask how you feel about the Red Sox?
I love the Red Sox. The reason I came to Boston a day early was to go to the Red Sox game.
So this is appropriate,
Wow.
genuflect, is appropriate.
Yeah.
Studied journalism and sociology. I wrote a senior thesis on Jewish radicals, how come there were so many of them at the time. Graduated in 1970, went to work as a reporter for the Chicago Sun-Times for 3 years. But then got into tenants' rights organizing in Chicago. From tenants' rights organizing to the University of Chicago. To study sociology and urban studies. His dissertation was on Chicago media and urban issues. And then came to teach here in Boston at Tufts, to teach sociology here. But he was sort of alternating between teaching sociology and then taking a year off to organize for Mass Fair Share, which was the major community organization here at the time. Back to sociology, then off to work with a guy named Lou Finford to start something called the Massachusetts Tenants Organizing Project. So you can see a little pattern here. Then in 1984, went to work for then Mayor Ray Flynn as deputy mayor of Boston with a focus on housing policy. And that's a role he served in from 1984 to 1992. And then moved to Occidental College in LA to teach politics, chair the Urban Environmental Policy Department. He does some interesting things there. He teaches, of course, on community organizing. He started something called Campaign Semester, where students actually work on a political campaign for the semester, get a full credit for it, and it integrates that into their study, a summer program for community organizing. So, this is anything but a linear, narrow academic trajectory, and a lot of things you can see why we have some affinity here. But he also, I've never met anybody as prolific as Peter. His writing for LA Times, The Nation, Huffington Post, American Prospect, it's phenomenal. And I had the privilege, I had the privilege to work with Peter. We co-authored a piece for the Washington Post op-ed in 2009 when nothing was happening on healthcare, called We Have the Hope, Where's the Audacity? You can imagine who that was addressed to. And that was fun. His pictures right there. Yeah, no, I see. That's very small. Small picture. But to the left. He's authored 4 books, including Place Matters, Metro Politics of the 21st Century, The Next Los Angeles, Struggle for a Livable City. He's on the board of the LA Alliance for a New Economy, organized something called Invest in Kids, which is an advocacy program for public education. I served as an advisor to Mayor Villaraigosa in LA, and continues to work on a whole variety of, as you can see, a organizing projects. He's married. His wife Carrie is a nurse practitioner. He has twin 16-year-old daughters. And he's going to share with us about his new book, Greatest Americans of the 20th Century, the Social Justice Hall of Fame. So let's welcome our friend Peter Dreier.
Thank you, Marshall. I have a bunch of former students in the audience, and some friends, and the daughter of a friend, and I know we're competing with the police commissioner of Boston downstairs at the forum, so I appreciate your coming up to the penthouse and being interested in justice instead of bombing. There's also a Red Sox game tonight, so we could have done that. I actually, as I was coming here on the tee, I thought about getting off on Kenmore Square. I took them all the way to Harvard Square, so I did. And I also appreciate the fact that that Tim and Marshall took the time out of their busy schedules to put this together. I've been on a series of book tours around the country, talking to universities and community groups and churches and synagogues and bookstores, and it's always fun to talk to people who care about social justice and care about making the world a better place. So I'm going to start off with a thesis, and then I'm going to talk about the book and some of the people in the book, and then some of the lessons I learned from writing the book, and then entertain your criticisms, your comments, and your questions. Can you give me a signal when it's about a half an hour? Okay. Is it on? Can you hear me?
I just want to make sure that.
Okay.
Is that okay?
All right.
Good. Okay.
For taping.
Yeah.
So I can't lie. So here's my thesis. America is a better society today than it was 100 years ago or 50 years ago. Now, that's controversial in some circles, including among many of my students. There are a lot of faculty members around the country, and this is, I'm going to be a little provocative here, particularly younger faculty members, I think, but not just younger faculty, who consider themselves radicals, Marxists, social justice advocates, who will tell you that America is as racist, homophobic, sexist, and unequal today as it was 50 or 60 years ago or 100 years ago, and that nothing much has really changed. That's become, I wouldn't call it accepted wisdom, conventional wisdom, but it's not an unusual sense. And a lot of the faculty that say that are, the epithet is armchair radicals. I have a lot of colleagues, I'll say this to the camera, I hope they don't hear this directly, but I have a lot of colleagues, not just at Occidental, but around the country, who think of themselves as radicals, but they wouldn't know a picket line if they fell over it. And what that means to me is that they have a theory of what's wrong, but not a theory of what to do or what's right. And so that's a very paralyzing view of the world. It's particularly paralyzing for students, who learn from their professors or learn from writers that they read in their textbooks and classes of how bad things are, how unfair things are, how undemocratic society is, and then they say to their teachers, well, what should we do about it? And often the response is, that's not my job. My job is to tell you how bad things are. Your job is to figure out what to do about it. I think that's irresponsible. And I also think it's wrong. Not just wrong morally, but it's actually wrong in terms of the way in which pedagogy should happen. That there is a long tradition in America of social justice activism, that at any moment in American history it would have been easy to say, woe is me, the society is crumbling, things are getting worse. But people find a way, some people find a way, to learn the lessons from the past and to inject those into the present about how to bring about a better society. And so if you think about, if I were standing, if this building didn't exist, but if I were standing here 100 years ago, and someone said to me, well, what do you think we should be doing to make America a better place. I would say things like, well, it would be good to have, women should have the right to vote. There should be a minimum wage for working people. The government should have laws protecting the environment, protecting consumers from unsafe food and medicines and consumer products. There should be laws protecting workers from unsafe and dangerous workplaces. Old people shouldn't die of poverty when they retire, but there should be some kind of old age insurance with social safety net for what we would call senior citizens today. There should be a law against lynching, and African Americans should have the right to vote. We should dismantle what back then were called Jim Crow laws. Workers should have the right to unionize, and gay people should have the right to live their daily lives without the burden of discrimination and stigma, and maybe even have the right to marry. If I said any of those things in the year 1900, you'd think I was crazy. You'd think I was a utopian, a communist, a socialist, impractical, unrealistic. All of those things are taken for granted today. Even gay marriage, which was 5 years ago wasn't even something that people told very much about, is now accepted by the majority of the population. It still hasn't been institutionalized, except in 10 states. But all of those things, the women's right to vote, workers' right to unionize, it doesn't mean that our society is perfect, not by any means. It doesn't mean that there's a lot more struggle and activism and change that has to happen. But it's also clear that things have gotten better. And that if we think about, for example, in 1960, the state of race relations in this country, there were still lynchings happening in the 1960s. There were still Jim Crow segregation laws. It was, a different world. There was still the daily violence against African Americans, not only in the South but in the North. It doesn't mean that we have eliminated racism or that there's not discrimination going on. But for professors and teachers and others to try to inculcate students with the idea that things are not better today than they were on race relations, for example, 50 or 60 years ago. It's almost like what it's really saying is that the civil rights movement didn't happen. And all the things that I just mentioned before that are things that today we take for granted are things that were once considered radical, are the result not of leadership at the top having these great ideas and imposing them on society, but the result of social movements, of the environmental movement, the civil rights movement, the labor movement, the women's suffrage and the women's equality movement, the gay rights movement, the consumer movement, anti-war and peace and pacifist movements throughout the 20th century. And I wrote this book to celebrate the heroes, the leaders of that movement, and to remind us that we all stand on the shoulders of the people who stood out, took leadership, embraced change, what we say today is thought outside the box, helped to build movements in different ways, became allies, if they were politicians, became allies of activists and organizers, were thinkers and theologians and musicians and artists who spread the gospel of social justice through their art and their writing, and helped to propel America in a positive direction, being more democratic, more livable, more humane, and more sustainable. And those movements are often forgotten when we talk about the things we take for granted. And so the exercise I'd like to do, and I'll ask you to think about this now, and I'll come back to it at the end, is so we're in the year 2013. Most of you are probably in your 20s. So assume that you are married, you have children, your children have children, and it's 75 years from now. So we're now talking about the year 2088. 2088. Right? What are some of the radical ideas today, things that are considered impractical, radical, utopian, crazy, unthinkable, that your grandchildren will take for granted. That your grandchildren will look back and ask you, Grandma, Grandpa, I can't believe that back when you were in college, right, that your society, it's kind of like when my kids ask me, I started late, I have 16-year-old daughters. One of my daughters asked me, not too long ago, a couple years ago, Daddy, what's a typewriter? We saw a movie with a typewriter. She just, did you ever use a typewriter? Okay. So think about, and I'll come back to this at the end. What are some of the things that your grandchildren will take for granted in a more egalitarian, a more humane, more livable, more democratic society that today we might think of as impractical? And that's, the people in this book are the people that thought those thoughts in 1900 and 1920 and 1950 and 1960s, 1970s up through the turn of the century, 21st century. And then the last chapter of my book is called The 21st Century So Far, and it talks about some of the heroes of today. And if I were going to write a book, or not me, but one of my students or someone else is going to write a book 60, 70 years from now called The 100 Greatest Americans of the 21st Century, Social Justice Hall of Fame, the last chapter has some names of people and some movements that might be candidates to be in that book for the 21st century. I wrote an article in Truth Out a couple months ago about some of the successful organizing of 2012, some of the victories, progressive victories. It's important for us to celebrate our victories, not get cynical, even in a period where America seems to be holding its breath, trying to decide what kind of society we want to be. We're kind of moving in two directions or three directions simultaneously. So it's important to hold on, not to the false hope, but to the real hope that we can change our society if we organize effectively and we organize broadly and we learn the lessons of history. And so the book was an attempt to, through the voices and the experiences and the lives of these 100 people, to learn those lessons. A lot of people ask me, how did I come up with this list of 100 people? There are three categories of people. When I was writing the book, I thought about three different categories of people. The first are organizers and activists, people that built these movements from the bottom up, starting with someone like Rose Schneiderman, who was a Jewish immigrant from Eastern Europe, who was a labor organizer, a garment worker in New York, in the sweatshops of New York, and helped to build the first women's garment workers union after the Triangle Fire of 1911, where 142 teenage girls were burned to death in a factory fire. There was a great upheaval for social justice, for improving the factory conditions and the sweatshops in New York. And Rose Schneiderman was one of the leaders of that movement. But she also had help from other people who were not part of her experience, not part of her media experience. And one of them was the daughter of the richest man in the world, J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan's daughter, Angela, was one of the upper-class women who came out to support the working-class immigrant women who were the sweatshop workers in New York and also in Chicago and other cities, but mostly in New York. And Angela Morgan was the daughter of the richest man in the world, and she was out there during the winter on the picket line, holding a sign about justice for garment workers and trying to keep the flame of social change alive. And Rose Schneiderman was both excited and enthused and a little bit repelled by the scene of Miss Morgan and her friends who she recruited to come with her, marching up and down in front of these garment factories in the Lower East Side of New York in their mink coats in the middle of the winter. They would donate money to what today we would call a strike fund, and they would help feed the children, of the garment workers when they were on strike, and she helped to rent a big building, the Metropolitan Opera House in New York, to have a community meeting to help middle class and upper class people to support the garment workers. And so Rose Schneiderman called Miss Morgan and her friends the Mint Brigade. And you know, she was with a little bit of awe and a little bit of disdain at the same time. And the organization that she created to help and work with to help create this alliance between upper class and working class women, there was mostly women, was called the Women's Trade Union League. Other people came through that organization and were politicized by that organization. It was a core of people that understood the importance of building a coalition and alliance. One of the women that came through that was Eleanor Roosevelt, who's also in my book, who had her first experience as an activist working with the Women's Trade Union League and also with a settlement house in New York called the Henry Street Settlement, where she taught dancing to working class children and working class women. Another person who was part of that cauldron of social justice organizing in New York at the time was Louis Brandeis, who later became a Supreme Court justice. He was the first public interest lawyer. He went to Harvard Law School. He grew up as an assimilated Jew in Kentucky, Louisville, Kentucky. He moved to Boston to go to Harvard Law School. He graduated first in his class. He had a very successful private law firm practice, and eventually he said to himself, something I wish more people would say today, he basically made enough money, you know, representing his clients. He said, I'm going to spend the rest of my life doing what today we would call public interest law, pro bono law. And one of his first cases was representing women in Oregon, who Oregon had passed a law protecting women from being abused on the job by limiting their work hours to 40 hours a week. It was called Mueller versus Oregon. He represented the state of Oregon and the women who were the workers in Oregon defending that law in the Supreme Court. It was the first major social justice Supreme Court decision where they used hard data to demonstrate that women that worked more than 40 hours a week were their health, their psychological and physical health was harmed. And his research assistant on that, who did it's called a Brandeis brief now. It's what lawyers call a Brandeis brief, where you bring, we now take it for granted, you bring hard data, not just theory, but hard data into a court case. His research assistant that gathered all that information was a woman also in a book called Florence Kelley. Florence Kelley was a leader at Hull House in New York, in Chicago, one of the first settlement houses, the first kind of social work organizations. He was also a community organizer, along with Jane Addams and some other people in Chicago, and became a model for lots of other women. Florence Kelley later became the head of something called the National Consumers League. National Consumers League was a national organization of mostly women consumers in support of the labor movement. And they were the ones that invented the union label. You've probably heard this phrase, look for the union label. If you want to get, you know, quite a few students in the last 10 years on college campuses have been active in the anti-sweatshop movement. And the anti-sweatshop movement is a way of saying, don't buy clothing that's made in sweatshops, buy clothing that's made under good working conditions. How do you know whether a piece of clothing you're wearing is under good working conditions? You look for the union label. There aren't that many anymore, but there used to be. Well, my dad was working in the clothing industry. Almost all the clothing that Americans wore was made in the United States and made by union workers. Today, about 90% of the clothing we buy is made overseas by not non-union workers, but in sweatshops. So Florence Kelley was the leader of the movement to protect, to pass child labor laws. The first child labor law was passed in Illinois in the early 1900s, and she built this national organization. She helped to create the union labor movement, and she gave a talk at Mount Holyoke College in the early 1900s, and one of the people in the audience was a young upper middle class woman who grew up in Worcester, Massachusetts, and heard Florence Kelly, and said, I want to be like her. And that woman was Frances Perkins. Everybody know Frances Perkins? Woo! Okay. The first woman cabinet secretary, the first the Secretary of Labor under Franklin Roosevelt. But before she did that, she was involved in the National Consumers League, the National Women's Trade Union League, and involved in being the leader of the movement for factory reform after the Triangle Fire. And her biggest ally in that was a state senator in New York named Robert Wagner, who later became a U.S. senator. He's also in my book. And became the ally of the labor movement and of consumer groups in the U.S. Senate. So within, and he was a German immigrant. So Florence Kelly, Rose Schneiderman, Justice Brandeis, Robert Wagner, Frances Perkins. They were all part of a movement for social justice. They all played different roles in that movement for social justice. There were other people involved in that movement that played different roles. One of the people in my book is Upton Sinclair. Upton Sinclair wrote muckraking journalism about the miserable factory conditions in Chicago and elsewhere, and he helped to raise public awareness of these miserable conditions. Another one was a photographer in my book named Louis Hine. Probably many of you have seen photographs of workers on the steel beams building the Empire State Building. He wrote a whole book called, he photographed the workers building the Empire State Building. But he really became well known as a photographer of child labor. And he went around the country taking photographs of children as young as 6 years old working in farms and factories and mills and mines. And these were published in magazines and newspapers. The modern equivalent would be Mother Jones or The Nation or some magazine like that. So he was a photographer that exposed the injustice of child labor. So you had photographers, lawyers, organizers, activists, politicians. And so the first group of people in my book were the organizers. The second group of people in my book were the politicians who had to translate these radical ideas into public policy, and Supreme Court justices that had to rule on whether these things were constitutional. And so the politicians in my book include Theodore Roosevelt, three presidents, Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, and Lyndon Johnson, who's probably the most controversial person in my book. Philo LaGuardia, the mayor of New York, who not only was responsible for many of the great social welfare, pioneering social welfare urban policies, but also was the mayor that pushed the Brooklyn Dodgers to integrate. And you won't hear his name in the movie 42 about Jackie Robinson, but I wrote an article in The Atlantic last week about this. There was a whole movement of civil rights and radical activists a decade and a half before Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier, demanding the integration of baseball. And Philo LaGuardia was one of those. Another one of the people who actually organized pickets in front of Yankee Stadium and Dodger Stadium, Ebbets Field, and Polo Grounds, where the Giants played in New York, was a congressman named Vito Marcantonio, who was a left-wing congressman representing Harlem. He was Italian, but back then Harlem was mostly Puerto Rican and Italian. Another politician was Upton Sinclair, who ran for governor of California in 1934. He was a writer, but also ran for office on an End Poverty in California platform, and he helped to propel California into the Democratic Party, and he put a lot of pressure on President Roosevelt to be more progressive, as did his wife Eleanor, and as did his Secretary of Labor, Frances Perkins, who were all in my book. Another politician in my book is the great late Paul Wellstone. Even today, Democrats who are wondering whatever happened to the Democratic Party when they want to know what is a progressive, what should a progressive be doing in the Democratic Party, and they often use the phrase, what would Paul Wellstone have done? And then there's people that, like Upton Sinclair that ran for office but didn't win. Eugene Debs was a labor organizer. He was the leader of the Socialist Party, and he was also He was also a politician. He actually got elected. He was in the state legislature of Indiana. He's mostly famous for having run for president on the Socialist Party ticket. And if you look at the Socialist Party platform in 1912, Socialist Party platform, you can find it online. It includes things like the minimum wage, the vote for women, environmental legislation, farm subsidies for family farmers, and other things that today we take for granted. Back then were so radical that he only got 1 million votes. He only got 6% of the vote in 1912. I want to tell you about another socialist. Anybody here ever heard of Victor Berger?
Milwaukee.
Okay, you're from Milwaukee. Okay. Well, you are unusual because Victor Berger is one of the most unknown people in the book. I'd say half the people in the book, most people never heard of. Most, normal, ordinary, non-lefty people never heard of. And Victor Berger is one of them. So Victor Berger was a Jewish immigrant from Austria, came to the United States in the late 1800s, moved to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where he became a school teacher, and he became the editor of the daily newspaper that was sponsored by the labor movement. The labor movement in Milwaukee back in the late 1800s and early 1900s was mostly based around the beer industry, the breweries, because Milwaukee was the brewery capital of America. It's no longer is. Most of the breweries have closed down. Miller Beer, its slogan used to be the beer that made Milwaukee famous. And of course, what's the name of the baseball team in Milwaukee?
The Brewers!
The Brewers, of course, right? Because of that. Right? So Victor Berger became the editor of the labor paper. Back then, most cities had a newspaper that was sponsored by the labor movement. We have that today. The paper was printed in English, German, and Polish. That was the immigrant base in Milwaukee. And he became kind of the mayor daily of Milwaukee. He was a politician. He ran a machine, but it was a socialist machine. And they elected Socialist Party members to the city council and to the school board. And they ran an incredibly efficient and uncorrupt administration. Every mayor of Milwaukee between 1910 and 1960 was a socialist.
Except for 8 years.
But, okay.
There were 8 years of a Democrat-Republican.
Yes, okay. Well, you know your history. Thank you.
Milwaukee fact checker again.
Okay. All right. So,
There's one of every cat.
what was the starting lineup of the 1957 Milwaukee Braves?
We got Hank Aaron's all I know.
Okay, I can tell you that later. I know the starting lineup. So, anyway, so Victor Berger was a political machine leader, and the city council of Milwaukee was run and controlled by the socialists, and they did, among other things, they had the best public health system in the country. They ran they municipalized the utility company, so the gas, electrical, and water was run by the government rather than some corrupt private corporation.
Sewer socialism.
Yes, they call themselves sewer socialists. That's right. You're taking all my good lines. Milwaukee has some of the best parks and playgrounds in the country on the waterfront, right? And although they didn't have zoning laws back then, they passed laws to ban development along the waterfront because they wanted the working class to have access to the water and the parks and the playgrounds. And so you don't see big luxury mansions built on the water in Milwaukee like you do in a lot of other cities. They had a great public education system. They had art classes for adults. They taught English, today we call English as a second language classes for Polish and German immigrants. It was really a very progressive and extremely well-run government. They used to win awards from various governments. Today would be the Kennedy School for having the most efficient municipal government in the country. And in 1910, Victor Berger 1911, he got himself elected to Congress. He was the first socialist elected to the U.S. Congress. The second one was a guy named Meyer London in New York. And Victor Berger introduced legislation in Congress to give women the right to vote, the Socialist Party platform, basically to nationalize the railroads and the banks. You can certainly use that now, at least the banks, and to pass what he called old age insurance. Back then, old age insurance was this radical idea, but 25 years later, the New Deal passed Social Security, in part thanks to the organizing of Francis Perkins. So I was giving a talk about 6 months ago at the University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee, and about my book. And I was really excited to go to Milwaukee, where I think I'd been once before, maybe 25 years earlier when I lived in Chicago. And I wanted to, go there, give my talk, but I also wanted to imbibe the spirit of Victor Berger somehow, and find out, things about him when I was there. So I was talking to a group of mostly students and faculty at the university. Some people from the community came. And I asked people, first of all, most people had never heard of Victor Berger. So unlike you, most of your fellow Milwaukeeans apparently hadn't heard of him, at least at the university. So I asked people, are there any monuments to Victor Berger here in Milwaukee? Is there a statue of Victor Berger? Nobody could think of one. Is there a building named after Victor Berger? Is there a street called Victor Berger Boulevard in Milwaukee? And nobody could come up with one. And then in the back of the room, some guy raised his hand, looks like he's in his 60s, and he says, I went to Victor Berger Elementary School. Do you know where Victor Berger Elementary School is?
No idea.
And the reason you don't is because it doesn't exist anymore. Because in the 1970s, this guy, I said to the guy, where is it? I want to go visit it. I'd like to see the plaque on the wall that says Victor Berger was here. So I went to look, so I asked him, where is it? And he says, it doesn't exist anymore. I said, why not? He said, because they changed the name to Martin Luther King Elementary School in the 1970s. And so I said, why? He didn't know why, but I later found out that Milwaukee was losing population because of deindustrialization, and wasn't building any new schools. And so, back in the 70s, lots of people were naming buildings and roads and highways and monuments to Martin Luther King, justly so, and later they had a national holiday after Martin Luther King. So Milwaukee wanted to honor Martin Luther King, but they weren't going to build any new schools. So they changed the name of the Victor Berger School to the Martin Luther King School. It was in an African-American neighborhood. It seemed to be the right one to pick. And people had forgotten who Victor Berger was anyway, so it wasn't like a big movement to stop anybody from doing it. So I thought that was pretty sad. So I said, well, shouldn't somebody do something for Victor Berger? And I was wondering, well, can you name a street after Victor Berger? Can you build a statue to Victor Berger? I said, what about changing the name of that school back to Victor Berger School? But of course, that would offend people who would see that as dissing Martin Luther King. I said, well, why don't you just add Victor Berger's name to the school rather than exchange it with Martin Luther King? But of course, then I figured out what the school would be called. Burger King! The Burger King School. Woo! So that wouldn't have been a very good idea. Right. So when I came home, back to LA, I wrote an op-ed in the Milwaukee Journal, which is the daily newspaper in Milwaukee, Journal Sentinel, reminding me, sort of saying how sad it was that people had forgotten Victor Berger, and encouraging the people of Milwaukee to do something to celebrate his life and his work. And it could have fallen on deaf ears. I didn't know anybody was going to do that, but I got an email about 2 months ago or something like that saying there's now a committee. Some people at the university, some people in the labor movement of Milwaukee. We're trying to figure out what to do to celebrate Victor Berger's life. So I was glad to know that it had some impact. And in some ways, that's why I wrote this book, because I want people to remember people like Victor Berger. Okay. So I want to talk a few more people. Just to get a sort of flavor of some of the people in the book. There's quite a few people in my book who are famous, but they're not famous for their progressive politics. And one of them is Dr. Seuss. Woo! And you've all read Dr. Seuss, or had Dr. Seuss read to you probably by your parents. So I certainly read them to my children. Turns out Dr. Seuss's real name is Theodore Geisel. He's the most well-read children's author in the history of the world, more than Aesop, more than the Grimm brothers. His books have been translated into over 40 languages. He sold millions of copies of his books. And the image most people have of Dr. Seuss is of a kindly old guy that draws wonderful drawings and teaches kids how to expand their vocabulary. And that's consciously what he set out to do, to increase the kids' vocabulary, having these wonderful drawings and being sort of colorful and idiosyncratic. But what a lot of people don't know about Dr. Seuss is that he started off life, he went to Dartmouth, he was the editor of the campus humor magazine, and then for the next 20 years or so, he made a living making commercials for corporations. And some of them were quite famous. And then in the late 1930s and early 40s, he went to work for a left-wing daily newspaper in New York called PM. It was one of the few radical newspapers in the country that was pro-New Deal. And he was their cartoonist. And there's a book of his PM cartoons. It was an afternoon newspaper. One of the writers on the reporters for the paper was Ian Stone, who was also a great journalist of the 50s and 60s. So Dr. Seuss drew cartoons, editorial cartoons against racism, segregation, anti-Semitism, and against Hitler, and against a great caricature of the Father Charles Coughlin, the right-wing radio priest who lived in outside Detroit. But he mainly wanted to be a children's author, so he quit his job after World War II with the newspaper, and he devoted his full time to writing children's books. And the first children's book that he became famous for was Cat in the Hat. But many of his books have a social justice message. And in an interview, somebody asked him, "What's your philosophy?" Because people didn't think of him as very political. And he said, "I don't like people that push other people around." That was his philosophy. And a lot of his books a lot of the children's books really reflect that. One of my favorites is a book called Yertle the Turtle. Yertle the Turtle is a book about a turtle named Yertle who is a bully, who bullies the other turtles and convinces them to step on top of each other to build kind of a pyramid so that Yertle can stand on the top and see the empire and see all. And he keeps asking him to get higher and higher so that he can see further and further. And this is clearly a metaphor for Hitler. And so all the turtles start piling on each other, and they do it willingly. And then eventually the little turtle at the bottom named Mac starts to complain. And this is Yertle the Turtle. This is what Dr. Seuss says. Then again, from below, in the great heavy stack, came a groan from that. Came a groan from the plain little turtle named Mac. "Your Majesty, please. I don't like to complain, but down here below we are feeling great pain. I know up on top you are seeing great sights, but down here below, we too should have rights. We turtles can't stand it. Our shells will all crack. Besides, we need food. We are starving," groaned Mac. And then Mac sneezes. And when he sneezes, he disrupts the stability of the pyramid, and all the turtles come tumbling down into the mud. And the story ends with these lines. "And today the great Yertle, that marvelous he, is king in the mud, that is all he can see. And the turtles, of course, all the turtles are free, as turtles and maybe all creatures should be." So that's Dr. Seuss. That's I use that in my community organizing class.
It's a new reading. No, it's a new reading.
And probably some of you have seen the new movie The War Act, which came out last year. It's Dr. Seuss's story about how corporations are abusing the environment and how we have to fight big business to clean up our natural resources. There's another book called The Butter Battle Book. Have you ever read that one? So there's a big wall, and on either side of the wall there's these two groups of people, the Ukes and the Zooks. They look exactly alike, right? But they hate each other. They don't remember why they're supposed to hate each other, but they do. And so in order to protect themselves from the other side, they build bigger and bigger weapon systems. And Dr. Seuss gives these weapon systems great names and draws these great drawings of all these new contraptions. And what's this about? It's clearly about the arms race in the 1960s between the United States and the Soviet Union and how stupid it is. Right? And he's got another, one of my other favorite stories is called The Stooges, which is about anti-Semitism, about this group of these animals, these creatures that have to wear these yellow stars. It's clearly about the yellow stars that the Nazis made the Jews wear during the Holocaust. And so Dr. Seuss is one of those people who's famous, but he's not famous for his politics. Another one of those people is Helen Keller. Helen Keller is best known for being blind. But our image of Helen Keller is frozen when she's about 7 years old, because what most people know about Helen Keller, they know from the movie The Miracle Worker, starring Patty Duke and Anne Bancroft. And the moment in the movie that's kind of the epiphany, the heroic turning point in the movie, is when her teacher, Anne Bancroft, or Anne Sullivan in real life, teaches her is teaching her to read, basically, and to communicate. And the turning point moment is when they go outside to the water pump, and Anne Sullivan pumps water into Helen Keller's hand, and for the first time she connects this substance called water with a word. And the way she says the word water, she's learned how to say, she makes the connection, but she calls it wawa. She can't quite say water yet. She later spoke more clearly. So it's frozen in time. Every state in the country gets to put 2 statues in the rotunda in the Capitol building in Washington. In Alabama, which is where Helen Keller is from upper class family in rural Alabama, Alabama decided to put a statue of Helen Keller in the rotunda, and that's what they put, a statue of Helen Keller at the water pump. And so our image of Helen Keller is frozen with this 7-year-old girl. But it turns out Helen Keller came here to Radcliffe. She was the first blind person to graduate from Radcliffe. She was radicalized here by her teacher's boyfriend and later husband, who was a socialist. She read Karl Marx in Braille in German. And she also went around to some of the poor neighborhoods of Boston and to some of the settlement houses, some of the social work houses in Boston, where she she grew up in a wealthy family, met poor people, and she discovered that the incidence of blindness is higher among poor people. And she began to make the connection between poverty and health issues, and poverty and injustice and industrial capitalism. She became a socialist, and she campaigned for Eugene Debs for president, later for Robert Fowler, who was also in the book, who ran for president on the Progressive ticket in 1924. She was probably the most famous person in the world in the 1920s. Lots of books were written about her. A couple movies were made about her. But by the time she graduated from Radcliffe, she was a pacifist, she was a socialist, she was a feminist, she was an ally of the labor movement. And when she gives speeches around the world, she talks about not only about her own issue called blindness, you could really call her the mother of the disability rights movement, but she also talked about these other issues. And she's a very prolific author. She wrote many books and lots of articles, particularly about women's issues and peace. In the 1920s, a movie producer made a movie about her, starring herself as herself, called Deliverance. And their opening night was supposed to be in New York, and she came to New York to go to the opening of the premiere of the movie about her. She gets there, and it turns out there are people picketing in front of the movie theater. Turns out the workers in the movie theater were on strike. So Helen Keller had to decide what to do. Do I go into the movie theater to watch the movie, or at least to hear the movie about me, right? Or do I do something else? She joined the picket line, and she was holding a picket sign. And the word got out, and newspaper photographers and reporters came, took pictures of the most famous person in the world picketing in front of the movie theater. The owner of the movie theater got so upset by this, he came outside, what's going on, and he settled the strike right there. And they went inside and watched the movie. So, if you go on the official Helen Keller website, her homestead in Alabama is a National Historic Monument or place. You'll learn nothing about her left-wing politics. all we know about her from popular culture is how she learned how to read and speak, and her lifespan ends at 7 years old. I'll tell you about one and a half more. And I'll open it up. Miles Horton. Everybody know that name? Taken Miles. If you're taking Marshall's place, you'll probably some point heard of Miles. Miles Horton grew up in Tennessee in the early 1900s. His parents were factory workers, very religious. A lot of people in my book, their politics, a lot of it comes out of their religion, religious views, and social justice. He goes to the Union Theological Seminary in New York. He gets imbued with the philosophy of the Christian social gospel, like many people at the time. A lot of people in my book were influenced by the social gospel movement. Then he goes to Europe, and he goes to Denmark in particular. He learns about these schools called folk schools that were training the farmers of Denmark on how to be political, how to empower themselves. He comes back and he takes a tour of the United States. He visits Hull House and some other settlement houses, and he says, I want to do something like that. He moves back to Tennessee and he starts a training center, an organizing training center in rural Tennessee called the Highlander School, which still exists. It's had, I think it's 85th anniversary last year. And one of the principles is that people can educate themselves if they come together and learn how to empower themselves. And the other is racial integration. So in Tennessee in the 1930s, during the Depression, in rural Tennessee, Miles Horton starts a racially integrated training program for radical labor organizers, which you can imagine wasn't very popular with the local police or the local churches and so forth, most of them. And so the school got burned down a couple of times, and he got arrested a few times, and they tried to close down the school, but he kept it going. In the 1940s, a Jewish student at Smith College named Betty Goldstein goes down to the Highlander School for a week-long workshop to learn about journalism, how to be she was working on a college newspaper, and she wanted to learn about journalism. She goes to this workshop. She comes back to Smith College after that week or 10-day training session at Highlander. She becomes the editor of her college newspaper. She writes articles and advocates for fellow students to be sympathetic to the workers on campus. Here at Harvard, you had a living wage movement about 10 years ago, similar to that. She wanted the upper class women who went to Smith College to support the food service workers and so forth. She wrote lots of other editorials and stories about that. She graduates from Smith and she goes to work for the labor movement as an editor and reporter for some of the newspapers for different unions, including the United Electrical Workers, a left-wing union. Then she gets married. She moves to New York. She moves to the suburbs. She has a career writing articles for women's magazines like Good Housekeeping and things like that. Women's Day. And then her college asks her to write an article, a survey of what happened to the women who graduated from Smith College in her class. And so she does a survey and finds out that a lot of them are housewives, they're not using their education, they're unhappy. And out of that survey comes a book called The Feminine Mystique. Betty Goldstein became Betty Friedan. And one of the turning points of her life is that the week she spent at Highlander, started by Miles Horton. Rosa Parks. Everybody knows the story of Rosa Parks. December 1955, she refuses to move to the back of the bus. She gets arrested. There's a boycott. It lasts a year. The civil rights movement gets started. That's the conventional story. Rosa Parks was 42 at the time. She spent 20 years as an activist before that. She was active in the NAACP. She organized voter registration drives. She organized a protest at the local library for being segregated. She worked on a campaign to raise money for defense of the Scottsboro boys, a big controversial trial of 10 African-American boys who were put on trial for rape unfairly. She was an activist, a radical. In 1954, the Supreme Court rules that segregation in schools is unconstitutional. Brown versus Board of Education. Miles Horton and the Highlander School just decided to have a workshop for activists, black and white activists, from all over the South on what are we going to do now to implement the Supreme Court decision granted the Board of Education. They asked Rosa Parks to come to the Highlanders for this 10-day workshop. She comes, she has to borrow money from a woman named Virginia Dore, who's also in my book, who was a white civil rights activist in Montgomery at the time. She gets on a bus, goes to rural Tennessee, goes to Highlander, where she writes in her memoirs, it's the first time she'd ever been served food by a white person. It's the first time she ever felt that blacks and whites could live equally. It's the first time she'd ever had an experience of people talking to her across racial lines as an equal. And it gave her hope. Even though she'd been involved in the civil rights movement and protests for 20 years, this was a turning point in her life. She began to feel like that the society could change on even in the South. And a few months later, goes back from that workshop, and a few months later, she refuses to move to the back of the bus. She gets angry she's been angry by the segregation of the buses, but she finally decides to do something about it, and that's the catalyst for the modern civil rights movement. And so so Highlander influenced her. Another Highlander story. In the late 1950s, a group of African-American tobacco workers in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, come to Highlander for a workshop on labor organizing. Again, people from all over the South come to that workshop. And these tobacco workers, as part of their presentation describing the strike they're undergoing in Winston-Salem, sing a song that they sing on the picket line while they're on strike. And the song is a Negro spiritual called I Will Overcome. And there happens to be these two folk singers in the audience that week. One of them is a guy named Pete Seeger, who's in my book. Another is a guy named Carr-Ryan, who's also a famous folk singer, who's not in my book, but he's kind of famous that he went to Occidental College. He moves to Tennessee, becomes the music director of Highlander. And they hear this song, I Will Overcome, and it's a little unclear who did what, but eventually they changed I to we. They changed will to shall, so it's now we shall overcome. They changed the tempo of the song, so it's a little more upbeat, a little more hopeful, and they changed the guitar chords, and they sing We Shall Overcome. They create the new song, We Shall Overcome, out of this Negro spiritual. A few years later, February 1960, are the first sit-ins. 4 students at North Carolina A&T go to downtown in Greensboro, North Carolina to the Woolworths. They sit in. They don't get arrested the first day, but they get arrested the second day. There are, the idea spreads. There are sit-ins, mostly by black, but some white college students, all over the South. It becomes a national cause. People in the North begin to support them by boycotting the Woolworths in cities like Boston. A woman named Ella Berger, who's also in my book, realizes that all these sit-ins are going on, but it could fizzle out very quickly if something isn't done to keep the momentum going. So Ella Berger, who's been an organizer for the NAACP for about 40 years, goes around the South in her beat-up old car and talks to the students and says, you guys need to form some kind of organization to come together. And so I'm sure Marshall knows this story well, since he was involved with this movement. So you need to come together. So she says, she organizes a conference at her alma mater, a black college called Shaw University in North Carolina. A couple of hundred of these students come to Shaw University. They start this new organization called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, which becomes kind of the front line of the civil rights movement in the early and mid-1960s on voter registration and other things. Guy Carr-Ryan is invited to sing at this conference, the guy who was a Highlander, and in front of 300 activists from this new wave of civil rights. He teaches them the song We Shall Overcome, and that becomes the anthem of the civil rights movement, and that song becomes the national anthem of human rights around the world. And all that came out of Highlander. In other words, every movement has these interconnections between people doing different things. People involved in activism and organizing, politicians that play an important role in translating these ideas into these radical ideas into legislation or ruling on them in the Supreme Court. become allies of the movement, and then writers, theologians, musicians, photographers that build a sense of hope and optimism and possibility through their music, their writing, their poetry. Langston Hughes is one of the people in my book whose poetry played a big role in the civil rights movement in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. And so I've got a lot more stories to tell, but I don't have any more time, so I'll end with a couple of lessons I learned from this labor of love of reading and learning about these people and then writing this book. One is a lesson that I learned from, I say, my political mentor, Michael Harrington. He once said that if you're going to be an activist for social justice, you have to be a marathon runner, a long distance runner, not a sprinter. That the movements take time. That you have to build on success. That things don't happen overnight. You have to have a sense that what you're doing is for your children and your grandchildren, not just for. You'll have a lot of students, as I'm sure it happens here all over the country, you go to one demonstration, but if you don't get what you want, then you give up. Things didn't work. I guess I should go back to what I was doing before. You have to have a sense of history, have a sense of things take time. But you need to have small victories that build up. And eventually there might be this turning point. So number one is you have to be a long distance runner and not a sprinter. And to continue the metaphor of running, you have to also learn how to pass on the baton. You have to mentor another generation. You have to mentor people younger than you, or people just other people to continue to struggle. That leadership requires mentoring. It doesn't happen just because some people take to leadership. They have to be mentored and trained to be leaders. So you have to have a sense of being a long distance runner, and you have to learn to pass on the baton the way Florence Kelly passed on the baton to Francis Perkins, for example. Second lesson I learned is the importance of an inside and outside strategy, which is what Marshall and I wrote about in this article in the Washington Post a couple of years ago. That all social movements have to have people involved in protests, civil disobedience, churning out the protests and getting publicity for that, but you also need people on the inside, people who are working in government, people that understand how legislation gets passed. You have to have allies, both of politicians and staff people. I thought of myself as doing that when I worked for the mayor of Boston. I was kind of an ally of the organizers that I had been once been an organizer in Boston, then I became going into City Hall. There's always compromise involved in that. Sometimes the compromises are too compromising. You have to have a sense of, when a compromise is a dead end and when a compromise is a stepping stone. But it's inside outside. The great story there's two stories I tell about this. I'll just tell one. Bill Moyers told me this story. He's also in my book about how President Johnson invited Martin Luther King into the White House in 1963 to talk to him about the heat of the civil rights movement. They're trying to get They're trying to get the civil rights bill passed, and it was stalled in Congress. And so Johnson calls Dr. King into the Oval Office. The only other person in the room was Johnson's aide, Bill Moyers, who was his liaison to the civil rights movement. And the purpose of this meeting was for Johnson to convince Martin Luther King to call off the protests. And we said that Dr. King, I admire what you're doing, but you're making it hard for me to get this bill through Congress because there's a backlash, particularly among the more moderate Republicans and Democrats, because you're seen as this radical. Dr. King was called a communist and so forth by lots of people back then. Now he's a saint, but back then he was a communist. And so, I wish you'd call off the protests for a while so we can get this bill passed. And according to Bill Moyers, Dr. King, because it wasn't taped, Dr. King says, well, number one, I don't have the power to call off the protests. I'm not the dictator of the civil rights movement. And number two, even if I could, I would. Because whether you know it or not, our protests are making it easier for you. Because while we're in the streets creating a ruckus and changing public opinion, even polarizing public opinion, it makes you look more reasonable. Bill Moyers told me that it was the only time he ever saw Lyndon Johnson admit he was wrong. And he said, Dr. King, it took a while, but afterwards he said, Dr. King, okay, fine, I agree with you. You do what you do, I'll do what I'll do. we'll work together, and we have a common goal. And a couple months later, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Last person I'll mention, very briefly, Harry Hay. Anybody know who Harry Hay was? Harry Hay was probably the father of the gay rights movement. It's not that well known except among a relatively small circle of people. I write about him in the book because he was a remarkable pioneer. He was born, he went to college at Stanford, born in the early 1900s, moved to Los Angeles to become an actor. Wasn't a very successful actor, did some modeling, got involved with a circle of radicals, including Woody Guthrie and a guy named Will Geer, who was a famous Shakespearean actor who later was blacklisted in the McCarthy era and came out of blacklist and became famous again as Grandpa Walton on the television show The Waltons, which you can see in reruns on Nick at Night. Anyway, so we hung around with these radical circles of people, and then eventually joined the Communist Party, like many activists and radicals did in the 1930s. And he got involved in labor organizing, helped Woody Guthrie and Will Geer provide food for the striking workers in San Francisco in 1934. Went up to near where Marshall grew up in Bakersfield to help the farm workers organize, the tannery workers organize in California. Not as an organizer, but as a kind of supporter. And eventually he was kicked out of the Communist Party because he was gay. Even the Communist Party was, homophobic. They had enough trouble being communists, much less being communists who were called, homosexuals. Back then, being gay was a crime. You had more than 3 people in California. 3 gay men in a room at the same time was illegal. A lot of times they would have meetings, they'd have to have a woman there just to protect them from that, being arrested from that law. So Will Geer is part of this circle of radical homosexuals. But their radicalism and their homosexuality were sort of in 2 separate spheres. And he begins to say, well, maybe there ought to be a movement for gay rights as well. They called gay rights back then. In 1948, a lot of the left supported a guy named Henry Wallace for president of the United States. He was a former vice president who ran on a third-party ticket. And so Harry Hay decides to get his gay male friends together and to campaign for Henry Wallace as the radical candidate for president in 1948 against Harry Truman and John Dewey. And so, but they were going to start an organization called Homosexuals for Wallace. That wouldn't have done very well. So instead, they started an organization called Bachelors for Wallace. And I have a photograph at home that I found when I was doing my research of a rally at Wrigley Field, which is a baseball stadium in LA. It's also Wrigley Field in Chicago, but there's one in LA. 40,000 people that came to this Wallace for President rally. This was a real movement. It wasn't just a fringe thing like Ralph Nader's campaign. That's my opinion of Ralph Nader, by the way. He's also in the book, but I don't. I admire his consumer activism. I don't admire his presidential campaign. But, so anyway, so there's this group called Bachelors for Wallace. 1948, Wallace loses the election, but now they have these hundreds of people who've been involved in this effort. And Harry Hay wants to know, what are we going to do with all these people? So he starts this new organization called the Mattachine Society, which is the first gay rights organization in the United States. They eventually published the first gay rights newspaper, or magazine, which they had to send through the mail in a brown wrapper because people didn't want to be seeing it getting it in the mail. And eventually, in this group, they fought like police harassment in Los Angeles among the LAPD and so forth. They were only halfway out of the closet. They were still a fairly clandestine organization, but they did do some lawsuits against harassment and so forth. And a couple years later, the first lesbian organization gets founded called the Daughters of Miletus, modeled to some extent on the Mattachine Society. In today's terms, the Mattachine Society is quite a conservative organization, but back then it was quite a radical organization. Harry Hay later became kind of the iconic figure, the father figure of the gay rights movement. And when the Stonewall riots happened in 1969, kind of the first major wave of protest of the modern gay rights movement, Harry Hay was kind of a forgotten figure. And then he became kind of renowned again by this new movement called gay liberation. And he only died a few years ago in Los Angeles. be amazed at the enormous changes that have happened in this country, not only since he was alive, but in the last 5 years, the support for gay marriage and so forth that I mentioned earlier. So Harry A. kind of reminds us all, as I hope the other people in my book remind us, that once again, the radical ideas of one generation are often the common sense ideas of the next generation. But it takes movements, it takes organizing, it takes leadership, it takes persistence, it takes inside-outside strategy, it takes a willingness to work over the long haul. And it takes, the final lesson of my book is, it takes a movement that is broad enough to incorporate not just single issues, but a sense of the whole. That almost everybody in my book was not identified with just one issue. Jane Addams was a feminist. She was a socialist. She was a pacifist. She was the founder of the NAACP. She was the founder of the American Civil Liberties Union. She was the founder of the Settlement House Movement. Almost everybody was involved. Issues come and go, but the importance of building a movement that can change with the times, that can move from one issue to the next. And all of these people, a few of them, Barry Commoner, for example, was an environmentalist, but he was also a radical. He was also an economic justice person. He understood the linkages. Rachel Carson was an environmentalist, but she was also a feminist. But they understood the connections between all these issues. And the movements for today, I think, can learn that lesson. So many of my students, and perhaps here at Harvard, the same thing. They're activists, but they think of themselves, I'm a feminist, I'm an environmentalist, I'm involved in the gay rights issue, I'm involved in human rights in Darfur or something. But they have to understand they're part of the same movement. It's a movement for social transformation, economic justice, and democracy. And I know that there are probably a lot of you in the room who might be the people in the book in the 21st century. And I hope that that you learn from and are inspired by the people that came before you, because someday your children and grandchildren will wonder, what were you doing when you had the freedom and the time to be involved? And I do hope that your grandchildren ask you, the question, how was it possible that during your lifetime when you were in college that America was fill in the blank, and the things that we take for granted now in the year 2088. So I'd like to thank you, and I'd like you to answer the question now. What are some of the things that you would like your grandchildren to look back on for today and wonder, how could it have been that way? Because we take for granted a very different kind of society. Can you think of anything? Yes.
The erosion of our civil liberties associated with the war on terror.
So how will things be different 50 or 80 years from now?
There's not going to be sky is falling, frantic, reactionary, I don't even know how to describe it from the government and media and society and leaders in general. If there's anything happening to the so this is great.
So,
Higher education is going to be free for everybody.
all right, good. So most of the industrial countries in the world, it is. They think we're barbaric. That students graduate from college with 50, 70,000 dollars debt. They think that's nice. Yes.
Millwood, Diamond Lane.
Okay, so we don't roll back. Okay. What year will that happen?
I hope soon.
Okay. Okay. Very good. Milwaukee. Yeah.
There will be a multiracial lower class coalition of politics, which was killed in 2009 and 10.
Okay. All right. Yes. Good.
Look at law school at the same time.
Okay. Great. Okay. Great. That's,
No more Caldeo politicians in Latin America.
okay. Anything else? Yeah.
Safer food and personal care consumer products.
Okay. Great. Good.
No more death penalty.
Okay. Good. I'm glad. That's the one I always bring up. Because very rarely does anybody in the audience ever say that. So thank you. Yeah. I think we're moving towards a society where we're laws to death penalty. Yeah. Anyone else? Yes. Go ahead.
Women won't be doing all the work in society anymore.
Okay. Okay. Go ahead.
Close the wage gap.
Okay.
Corporations won't let everything.
Hey,
Maybe they won't be corporate.
Corporations won't give people any money.
Corporate wealthy people, that's important.
Yeah.
Good.
And more than two political parties at the national level.
That would require changing a lot of the rules.
Yeah, yeah.
Elections. Yeah. Yeah. So most of the things you said are things that, seem feasible, and some of them seem crazy, right? And the things that seem crazy that are things that, are possible, and the things that seem reasonable used to be considered crazy. And now there are things that we can actually consider, as possibilities. And so I think if you have that perspective, and I hope my book helps to draw out that lesson from that we can change the world, but it's not going to happen automatically. We can make it happen, and we can dream of a better society. But we don't have to be called dreamers. So there's a dream actor, people are called dreamers, right? But dreamers are often seen as impractical and utopian. But the radical utopian ideas of one generation often become the sense of the next generation, and that's our goal as progressives. So thank you very much. If you want to buy my book, I'll be happy to sign it. Any question? I got some questions. I got nothing else to do except to go out for a beer with Marshall.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good evening. My name is Mom Neo, and thank you for giving the talk here. I really enjoyed it, and I'm going to read about Victor Berger now.
Okay.
So there are activists and organizers that you have included in this book. I'm curious if you have seen any common thread or threads that motivated them not only just to start a campaign, but that sustained them with long distance marathon.
Yeah, that's a great question.
For me, their life for the struggle of social justice.
That's a great question. So what sustained them, what motivated them? So I didn't get a chance to talk about this, but one of the things I talk about in the introduction of my book is all the people in the book, I'd say, are heroes, but they're not saints. Even Martin Luther King is not a saint. They all have flaws. Too many people put the people in my book and other people like them on pedestals as if they're these perfect human beings. Alice Paul, the leader of the suffrage movement in the early 1900s, was an anti-Semite. Margaret Sanger, the founder of the birth control movement, Planned Parenthood, flirted for a while with eugenics, the racist movement, sort of anti-science movement. And so all the people in the book wrestled in some way or another with, how they're going to live their lives. Martin Luther King plagiarized his PhD dissertation. I don't think that takes away his accomplishments as a civil rights leader. So all the people had to wrestle with what motivated them, what kept them going. And as I said, none of them were perfect. I would say among the things I found in common were most of the people, at least in the first half of the 20th century, the first 2 years, a lot of their motivation was religion. Like I said, the social gospel among Protestants, the Jewish sense of repairing the world, and the sense of repulsion about anti-Semitism and universalizing their feelings about anti-Semitism to the rest of the world and dealing with racism and so forth. Betty Friedan talks about that a lot in her memoir, how she grew up in a small town in Illinois and faced a lot of anti-Semitism that helped her radicalize her. And the Catholic social justice teaching. Darky Gaze in my book, the founder of the Catholic Worker Movement, a lot of the Catholic people in my book had that sense. So that was one. A second thing is almost all the people in the book were mentored by other people. And I said that earlier, that it didn't come naturally. That they had to learn to be part of a movement. They had to learn leadership skills. And leadership comes in different ways. I mean, you don't think of Dr. Seuss as a leader of a movement. But he had a long-term commitment to social justice, which he spent his entire life doing. I mean, he spent 50 years as a children's writer, and the themes Arthur Miller, who's in my book, the playwright, and Tony Kushner, the more modern version of both in my book. You know, they both have devoted their skill as playwrights, and Tony Kushner did the movie Lincoln, to writing plays, and Tony Kushner's, and also Miller, movies that dealt with questions of social and economic injustice. They did it because they felt they were part of a movement. They weren't on their own. And that's part of the lesson of this book. But none of these people were heroes on their own. They were part of a movement. And they were supported by other people, and they were mentored by other people. And they felt the compulsion to mentor other people. Not all of them did. Bob Dylan's in the book. I don't think he's ever mentored anybody, but he's influenced thousands of other people to be protest singers or social activists through their music and their art. I'd say the final thread that that I think are something they have in common, although it's not everybody, is that they got their ego was satisfied by things other than money, but by being useful. Some of them made money, but most of Pete Seeger's a millionaire, but not because he started off to be a millionaire, because his music had sold a lot, but he did most of his money away. So they were motivated by, they got rewarded by things other than money, by having a sense of wanting to be useful to society and being part of a movement. And Staunton Lynn, who was an activist in peace and civil rights movement, once said that you can fix a car and an assembly line and feel like you're exploited, but you can fix a car for your friend and feel like you're being useful. Right? It depends on the context. Right? And so I think it makes a big difference how you use your talent. And let me say one other thing along this isn't to answer your question, but it reminds me of something else. I have a lot of students at Occidental, I'm sure Stephen wants you here, that come from fairly privileged families. I also have a lot of students that come from pretty poor families. And one of the things I really despise about some of my academic colleagues is that if they're lefties, is that they try to make these students feel guilty about their wealth, as opposed to saying, okay, you've inherited a lot of privileges. How are you going to use your talents and your privileges to make the world better, as opposed to feeling guilty about where you came from? There's a lot of that, on college campuses among professors, this sense of, if you're privileged, there must be something wrong with you, and you have to somehow show remorse, for the fact that your parents were wealthy, or you went to private school, or you rode horses when you were a kid, or whatever. As opposed to feeling like, well, what am I going to do with my life? Jane Addams is a great example. Jane Addams grew up in a very wealthy family in Illinois, one of the first generation of women that went to college. She could have done not a lot of things because there was a lot of sexism, but she could have done what most of her friends did, was be a matronly wife of a wealthy industrialist and lived her life that way. But she decided to make something of herself in a different way and got a different sense of reward. And so I think that's the people that grew up wealthy, which a lot of people in my book did. They became what some might call traitors to their class, but they didn't feel like traitors. They felt like they were making society better. They felt like the privileges they inherited were unfair. And they wanted to make a society that didn't have such privileges, that didn't have the level of stratification and justice that they had grown up with.
Yeah, one more question, and then we'll be walking next time.
Back to Milwaukee.
First, thanks for including Victor Berger. He's the best. Second, there must have been 1,000 possibilities for the 101st influential American. I wanted to ask you about two that I know that you know and have studied and commented about, George Wiley and Wade Ratke. And neither an angel, but both, I think, fairly influential, especially the second half of the 20th century.
Right.
And might they be included in the sequel?
Assuming there is a sequel. Well, I cheated a little bit, right? So the first chapter of my book, which is the introduction that explains some of the themes that I talked about at the end. At the the end of the first chapter, there's a list of 50 people who might have been in the book if I had more room. And Wade Raspy's in that list. Wade Raspy is the founder of Acorn. You know, he's a really good example of a person who's a hero, but now saying he really screwed up at the end of his Acorn life. He corrupted his organization in a way that didn't ever recover from. But he still was a remarkable organizer. Just like, you know, I don't hold it against Martin Luther King that he might do, but if he plagiarized his dissertation, it doesn't change my admiration for him. George Wiley was a chemistry professor at Syracuse University, where I went, although I didn't know him there, who later became the founder of the National Welfare Rights Organization, and he mentored Wade Raspy, so there's another example of that. You know, he could have been in it. I don't think he quite rose to, I mean, you know, it's somewhat arbitrary, do I think? You know, and I don't think he quite rose to the level of the people in my book. He wasn't around long enough as an activist to have that big of an impact. And the National Welfare Rights Organization was only marginally effective as an organization, only spawned lots of other people. Marshall and I once had this conversation, again, I remember this about 4 or 5 years ago. There are a lot of organizations that fall apart, but they spawn, you know, they become like training schools. Acorn was one of them. Acorn fell apart, but it trained thousands of organizers. The United Farm Workers eventually still exist. It's a shell of what it used to be. But thousands of people were trained by the farm workers. And a group I worked with in Boston here, called Massachusetts Fair Share, also collapsed through corruption and financing and so forth. But it trained, you know, hundreds of people who are now doing, you know, think about who the leaders of progressive politics in America now. You know, many of them came out of Mass Fair Share and some of the other groups that Mass Fair Share spawned. So the National Welfare Rights Organization played that role. So George Wiley should get some credit for that, as should Francis Pippin and Richard Cloward, who was kind of the two sociologists that had the idea for this organization. And there were a lot of women who were involved in mostly women, mostly black women who were involved in the organization, who became leaders and continued as activists. But, you know, I had to draw the line somewhere. And, you know, sort of Wade made the next 50, and George did.
And Peter, thank you so much for this book, for your work, for that great talk, and for being here. Appreciate it.